Jonas Pike adjusted the microphone once, looked down at the final card in his hand, and called the room back to order while the last of the dessert plates were still being cleared. Ruby stood at the side aisle with her clipboard pressed against her ribs, waiting for the usual donor thank yous and the quiet release that came when the lights rose. Vivian Brooks sat at the center table in silver silk, smiling at people she needed and ignoring people she already owned. Edward Walsh stood 2 steps behind the last row in the same plain dark suit he had worn all evening, hands loosely folded, cut on his knuckle, covered by the neat bandage Ruby had wrapped for him near the prep sink before cocktail hour. Jonas did not raise his voice. He read one line, calm as a bookkeeping entry. Before we close, I need to formally acknowledge Mr. Edward Walsh, controlling investor at 51% voting rights, and incoming chair effective tonight. The room changed shape without anyone moving chairs. Ruby's fingers loosened around the clipboard because she suddenly understood why Edward had asked quiet, precise questions all night, why he had watched every exchange without trying to be seen, why Clara Ives had gone still each time he walked past service doors. Vivian's smile held for 1 second longer than it should have, and in that second the expression looked like pain. Miles Dent reached for his water glass and missed the stem. Edward stepped forward only when Jonas moved aside. He did not look at Vivian first. He looked at Ruby. The scholarship transfer was received at 7:14 p.m., he said, as if confirming a delivery. We are restoring every student name to the program, and discretionary hold authority is revoked, effective now. Vivian stood so quickly her chair scraped the floor. You cannot issue governance changes from a podium. Jonas answered before Edward did, voice still procedural. The transfer documents were filed this afternoon and acknowledged by council at 6 o'clock. Announcement was pending until close of event under NDA. He held up a thin folder with coloured tabs. Emergency board acknowledgement is in packet C. Ruby felt the blood leave her face and return in a hard, hot wave. She had spent 8 years learning how to disappear inside rooms like this, and one sentence had made invisibility impossible. 8 years earlier, in 2018, she had stood in a different hallway holding a cardboard file box from her father's office, while men in dark coats carried furniture out through the front door. Her father had died in late autumn, fast and unfair. Before the legal dust settled around bills, he thought he had more time to manage. Vivian, her father's older sister, had arrived with a car service and a practical voice, telling Ruby she could stay at the townhouse until things stabilized. Stabilized became permanent through repetition, 1 month rolling into the next, until gratitude and dependency sounded like the same word. Ruby moved into the 3rd floor back room with sloped ceilings and a radiator that clanged at night. She took a position in Vivian's foundation office because it was available, and because family offered it, at least on paper. The title was Junior Events Coordinator, which meant she handled details nobody in photographs remembered. She printed place cards, tracked vendor invoices, fixed donor names when assistants typed them wrong, and learned which requests were actually commands. Vivian did not hit, scream, or throw things. Her preferred method was social geometry. She placed people where they understood their rank and corrected them in public when they forgot. Ruby became useful because she anticipated those corrections before they happened, which gave Vivian a smooth evening and gave Ruby another week of housing that was never officially discussed. By May 2026, the Ashford Hall Donor Gala had grown into the Foundation's highest visibility event. 180 attendees, 3 sponsors, 2 elected officials, and 1 merger rumour everyone pretended not to hear. Vivian hosted, Miles Dent attended as interim chairman, and Ruby carried the operational burden in shoes that pinched by 6 p.m. Clara Ives, the senior house manager at Ashford Hall, met Ruby at the loading entrance with a ring of keys and a look that missed nothing. Table 9 lost 2 vegan cards, Clara said, handing over a replacement envelope. Also, your MC wants an updated pronunciation for the Rao family. He is panicking quietly. Jonas always panics quietly, Ruby said, and Clara's mouth twitched into what passed for a smile in high-service spaces. The room was still bright, with setup light, when Edward arrived 40 minutes before cocktail hour. No entourage, no assistant, no visible badge. He came through the side corridor where speakers were being tested and asked a passing waiter where he could place his coat. The waiter pointed him towards staff storage without really looking at him. Edward thanked him and stepped aside while 2 bus carts rolled through. Ruby saw him near the card table because she was carrying alphabetical seat envelopes and nearly collided with him at the corner. He lifted his hand in apology, and she noticed the shallow cut across his knuckle, fresh enough to bead a line of blood. He had probably caught it on metal staging or a broken carton edge. "Hold on," she said, balancing the envelopes against her hip. She set them down, handed him bottled water from the service tray, and took a clean napkin from a wrapped stack. "Rinse it first." He looked at the napkin, then at her, expression reserved. "Thank you, Ms. Brooks, Ruby Brooks," he nodded once. "Thank you, Ms. Brooks." She expected him to ask where to sign in or which table he was assigned. He did neither. He rinsed the cut at the prep sink exactly as told, and when the blood welled again, she crossed to the side pantry, opened the first aid kit and came back with antiseptic and a narrow adhesive strip. She cleaned the knuckle quickly, pressed the skin closed, and wrapped it tight enough to hold through the night, then returned his hand without ceremony and picked up her envelopes before she lost another minute of setup. He watched the room in brief, deliberate glances, as if mapping exits, staff routes, and the donor cluster forming near the grand staircase. Ruby turned back toward the ballroom. Vivian intercepted her before she reached table 12. "Why are you stopping to chat in service corridors?" Vivian asked, smiling at a donor while speaking out of the corner of her mouth. "You are on assignment." Ruby kept her tone even. "He had a cut. I gave him supplies." Vivian's smile never shifted. "You are not here to make friends below your station. Place cards, Ruby." She turned to the donor at her elbow and added in a brighter public voice, "Some staff blur boundaries when events get busy." The donor followed Vivian's gaze to Ruby, then looked away with practiced politeness. 2 junior associates at the nearby table went quiet and busied themselves with water glasses they had already aligned. Ruby returned to table placements with steady hands and a jaw tight enough to ache by the time cocktail hour opened. And for the next hour she was moved off visible floor checks to back corridor tasks, where no guest had to wonder where she belonged. She took her 5-minute break alone in the linen room beside stacked chair covers and unopened candle cartons, chewing half a roll she did not taste while laughter drifted through the service door. No one came looking for her. When Clara appeared with an updated run sheet, she did not mention the rebuke, and Ruby did not mention it first. The silence sat between them like folded cloth, tidy and heavy. And Ruby stepped back into the ballroom with her face set before anyone could read what it had cost. The event moved into its practiced rhythm, and Edward remained difficult to place. He did not hover near VIP check-in. He did not seek introductions. He stood where people crossed paths, listening. When a bartender dropped a tray stem and glass scattered near the back bar, Edward crouched, moved 3 larger shards out of the aisle before anyone stepped on them, and returned upright without waiting for thanks. Ruby noticed because she was watching for breakage reports, and because nobody dressed as a major donor usually touched cleanup. Their second exchange happened beside the scholarship display wall, where framed photos of past recipients lined a velvet board under soft spotlights. Ruby was straightening one frame that hung crooked from a loose hook. "Those names, are they this year's or cumulative?" he asked. "This panel is cumulative," she said. "Tonight's recipients are in the printed program." "Who approves removals if a pledge fails?" She glanced at him, surprised by the directness. "Finance chair can place temporary hold pending replacement funds." "Temporary means how long?" "In theory, 48 hours. In practice, depends on politics." He gave the smallest acknowledgement, not quite a smile. "Thank you." No one else asked questions like that at a donor gala. People asked where to find the bar, who designed the floral arch, and whether the cello set would run late. Edward asked about authority pathways and time limits, like someone measuring stress points in wood. Miles Dent arrived at 7 with a laugh too loud for the entrance hall. He shook hands as if collecting pledges by touch. Vivian attached herself to his orbit quickly, introducing him as if he were already permanent chairman and not interim. Ruby delivered revised speaking cards to Jonas at stage left and caught fragments of Vivian's remarks to Miles near the champagne tower. "Tonight has to look clean," Vivian said. "No loose ends." Miles replied, "After the vote, everything gets easier." Ruby moved away before they saw her watching. The words sat in her chest, undefined and heavy. At 7:40 p.m., 10 minutes before first course, Clara found Ruby at the service station with a binder open to seating charts. "Your aunt changed table assignments again," Clara said quietly. "She moved you off floor supervision to back office reconciliation. That is punishment, not logistics." "I know." Clara handed her a keycard. "The West Office printer is jammed. Go clear it before Jonas starts." Ruby crossed the mezzanine corridor alone, heels silent on old carpet. The West Office door stood half open, lights off except for a desk lamp near the far wall. Voices came from the adjoining library, low and clear through the wood lattice partition. She recognized Vivian first, clipped and precise. "She thinks this is a family role," Vivian said. "Monday HR gives her severance and a recommendation letter." Miles answered with a short laugh. "You're keeping her in the townhouse? Until month-end if she behaves. The merger doesn't need sentimental residue. She has no vote, no leverage, no constituency." Ruby stopped breathing long enough to hear her pulse in her ears. She had not gone looking for secrets. She had followed a printer jam. One step closer, and the lattice would show her shoes under the lamp spill. So she backed away one measured pace at a time and closed the office door without a sound. In the service stairwell, she gripped the railing and counted backward from 10, because counting gave her something mechanical to do while the floor seemed to tilt. Tears threatened and did not fall. She had long ago decided Vivian would never see her break, and habit held even in an empty stairwell. When she reached 0, she smoothed her skirt, fixed her expression, and returned to the ballroom with the jam still unresolved, until Clara quietly covered it herself. Clara met her at the landing, saw her face, took back the keycard and asked no question at all. The overheard words solved one uncertainty and opened 5 more. Ruby no longer needed to guess whether Vivian intended to keep her once the merger settled. The answer was no, scheduled and tidy, with HR already assigned a Monday script. Housing, income, and the little buffer she had saved from years of careful spending now looked temporary in a way they had not 1 hour earlier. She still had 40 minutes of event operations before closing speeches, and 1 operational alert arrived before she could process anything else. The scholarship ledger flagged a shortfall of $12,000. A donor pledge expected by close of event had been placed on discretionary hold, pending board optics, language Vivian sometimes used when pressure tactics dressed up as prudence. If the shortfall remained at cutoff, 6 student names came off the announced recipient list before morning publication. Ruby stared at the line item until numbers blurred, hearing again the phrase "no vote," "no leverage," "no constituency," and recognizing the same logic being applied to teenagers who had done nothing wrong. She could escalate to Vivian and receive a lecture about timing. She could ask Miles and be ignored. She could leave it for finance and let the students disappear from the program quietly, because missing names rarely became public scandal when families had no microphone. The choice she could make without permission sat in the staff disbursement portal, a mechanism designed for emergency grants under $15,000, requiring one authorized staff credential and post-event documentation. Ruby had that credential because she processed vendor emergencies. Her personal savings account held $18,400. She opened her banking app under the prep counter while waiters lined dessert forks in military rows. She transferred $12,000 into the Foundation Emergency Holding Account, attached memo code SCH-Bridge, and approved the internal disbursement to scholarships line. Confirmation time stamped 7:14 p.m. The immediate consequence was practical, almost boring. The 6 names repopulated on the digital list. Clara received an automated alert and came to the prep counter with one sheet in hand. "You covered it," Clara said quietly. "It had to clear before print." Clara studied her for a second. "You understand this creates a record?" "I need it to create a record." Clara folded the sheet once and slipped it into Ruby's binder. "Then keep that copy on you." Ruby returned to floor duties with $6,400 left in savings, and a new form of calm that came from having chosen one concrete action in a night designed to make her powerless. Edward appeared again near the east doors as staff reset water pitchers. He looked at the binder in Ruby's hand. "Did the missing names return?" he asked. She met his gaze, tired and direct. "Yes." "What did it cost?" The question sounded factual rather than intrusive, and she answered before deciding whether she should. "Enough." He inclined his head once. "I'm glad they are on the list." A musician crossed between them carrying a cello stand, and when Ruby looked up again, Edward had moved toward the back of the room, where Jonas waited with closing cards. Closing remarks began at 8:35 p.m. Vivian gave a polished speech about stewardship, continuity, and vision. Miles followed with language so vague it could fit any merger, any board, any city. Ruby stood behind Pillar 3, checking timing signals for Jonas and keeping her face neutral while her aunt spoke about family values to 180 people. Edward remained in the shadows near the final row, still apparently unimportant, still unintroduced. When Jonas returned to the microphone for final acknowledgements, Ruby expected housekeeping logistics, valet notes, and donor thanks. She received the sentence that split the evening in half. "Before we close, I need to formally acknowledge Mr. Edward Walsh, controlling investor at 51% voting rights and incoming chair effective tonight." No drum roll followed. No spotlight chased him. The sentence carried its own gravity, and everyone in the room did quick private arithmetic on what 51% meant in a simple majority structure. Miles looked first at Vivian, then at Jonas, then at the folder Jonas held. Vivian's expression hardened into a social mask that could survive photographs and almost nothing else. Ruby replayed every interaction with Edward in rapid succession. The cut on his hand, his questions at the scholarship wall, his habit of standing where systems revealed themselves. She had offered water and a bandage to a man the room considered staff. The room had been wrong. She had been right for reasons that had nothing to do with status, and the realization landed as relief before it became shock. Edward moved to the front and accepted the folder from Jonas. He spoke in short lines. The ownership transfer closed at 6 p.m. today under NDA. Council has acknowledged filing. He opened to a tabbed page. Discretionary hold authority over scholarships is revoked now. Recipient names remain in program as printed. He lifted his eyes to the room. At 6:22 p.m., Ms. Brooks cleaned and bandaged my hand in a service corridor, returned to work, and asked nothing in return. That is the standard I intend to fund. Vivian stepped forward without being invited. You are making this personal. Edward's gaze stayed level. I am making this accountable. He handed one page to Clara, one to Jonas, and one to the Foundation's outside counsel, seated at table 2. Please note, transaction code SCH-Bridge was posted at 7:14 p.m. from Ms. Ruby Brooks's personal funds. Reimbursement executes at opening business Monday. The room rustled with a different energy, less gossip than recalibration. People who had ignored Ruby all evening turned toward her with startled faces, as if she had materialized from a blind spot. She did not smile. She stood where she was and let the facts do their own work. Miles tried to seize procedural ground. Interim chair recognition still sits with current board structure. Outside counsel spoke before Jonas could answer. Current board structure changed at close. Voting control is verified. She tapped the packet with one finger. Emergency acknowledgement meeting can be convened now if the room agrees. Agreement came quickly because resistance had already begun to look expensive. 3 board members who had shadowed Vivian for years requested immediate acknowledgement. Miles requested a recess, received one, and returned 6 minutes later with a resignation letter folded once down the center. He placed it in front of Jonas without eye contact and left through the west door. Vivian remained in place longer than pride advised. My family built this foundation, she said, aiming the line at sympathy. One investor does not erase institutional memory. Clara answered from beside the service station, voice even. Institutional memory includes what happened in the West office tonight. Monday severance was discussed for Ms. Brooks and housing removal by month end before this event concluded. She looked directly at counsel, then at Jonas. I stayed silent until control was formally read, because speaking earlier would have left her exposed with no protection and no standing in this room. Vivian turned sharply. You were eavesdropping now, Clara. Clara shook her head once. I was covering operations while your niece fixed your missing obligations, and I can corroborate her account word for word if statements are needed. She held up the printout with the 6 restored names. There is documentation. Ruby had dreaded this moment for years. The instant private harm became public language. She had imagined she would either collapse or rage. Neither came. She felt only a clean, exhausted steadiness as the hierarchy that governed her life lost its scaffolding in front of witnesses. Jonas called a narrow emergency vote from the stage, procedural and dry. The board acknowledged Edward as incoming chair by majority voice. Recorded in the packet, witnessed by counsel, effective that night. Vivian attempted one final objection on timing, and counsel answered with filing times, transfer confirmations, and acknowledgement language no one could dispute without perjury. The argument ended because paperwork is where social power becomes legal fact. Edward turned to Ruby only after the vote settled. He kept his voice low enough that nearby tables heard and no one else did. You can leave tonight with reimbursement guaranteed and references from counsel. You can also stay if the choice is yours. He paused. I would like you to stay. Ruby looked at him, then at Vivian. Then at the scholarship wall where 6 names would have vanished without a trace if she had chosen silence. The room waited for a speech she would never give. I'll stay, she said. By choice. Edward nodded once, as if confirming a term in a contract both of them intended to honor. The formal close happened 15 minutes later, stripped of celebration and full of careful exits. Guests collected wraps and whispered in clusters near the coat check. Donors who had courted Vivian now pivoted toward council tables with quick, polite smiles. Vivian left through the main stair without speaking to Ruby. No scene followed her. Isolation arrived faster than confrontation, and it looked like empty space around a familiar face. Ruby stayed to supervise breakdown because habit does not disappear on command. She counted centerpieces, signed linen release forms, and checked freight elevator logs with Clara. At 11:20 p.m., when the ballroom was nearly bare, she found Edward at the scholarship display wall, reading the names one by one. "Your hand," she said, noticing the bandage had loosened. He glanced down. "Minor." She handed him a fresh strip of medical tape from her kit. "Hold still." He did. She replaced the tape with efficient fingers, aware of how close they stood in the emptied room where earlier she had been ordered back into invisibility. "You knew who I was when we first spoke," she said softly, not accusing, simply naming. "I knew who you were," he said. "You did not know who I was." Was it a test? He considered that for a moment. Concealment lets me see how people treat what they think has no value. You were the only person from the guest side who stopped. Ruby absorbed the line without romantic flourish because he offered it as fact, and facts had become more trustworthy than promises in her world. "I stopped because you were bleeding." He met her gaze. "Exactly." Clara approached with final inventory sheets, read the room in one glance, and set the clipboard between them with discreet professionalism. "Truck manifest is complete. Also, Ms. Brooks, council confirmed your reimbursement order in writing." She tapped the attached email printout. "Monday morning execution." "Thank you," Ruby said. Clara lingered a second longer. "For what it is worth, you heard them correctly in that office. I will sign a statement to that effect, including the severance and housing language." Ruby nodded, gratitude sharp enough to hurt. "I may need that." "You will have it." Clara closed the folder and left them in quiet. At midnight, Ruby returned to Vivian's townhouse for what she knew was likely one of her final nights in the third-floor room. The house was dark except for a lamp in the front study. Vivian sat behind the desk, jewelry removed, face stripped of event polish. She did not ask where Ruby had been. "You made this difficult," Vivian said. Ruby set her keys on the side table. The scholarship names stayed on the list. Vivian's mouth tightened. "You always confuse duty with sentiment." Ruby did not take the bait. She had spent years trying to earn affection through competence, and the effort had ended when she heard herself described as residue behind a partition wall and scheduled for Monday severance. "I'll be out by the end of the week." Vivian looked surprised for the first time that night. "You cannot afford a move." "I'll manage." No argument followed because Vivian no longer controlled the one resource she had relied on, Ruby's uncertainty. Ruby walked upstairs, packed one suitcase halfway, and slept 3 hours without dreaming. Monday morning opened with administrative consequences that moved quicker than rumor. Reimbursement for the $12,000 bridge transfer, posted by 9:12 a.m., restoring Ruby's savings from $6,400 back to $18,400 before noon. Council copied her onboard minutes, confirming policy changes. Discretionary scholarship holds required dual approval. Emergency bridge funds could not be used as leverage, and director-level oversight for community programs would be filled immediately. At 10:30, Ruby sat in a temporary conference room at Foundation offices she had entered through side doors for years. Edward arrived with Jonas and counsel. No entourage, no performative authority display. He asked Jonas to read the appointment language for record clarity. "Pending standard paperwork," Jonas said. "Ms. Ruby Brooks is appointed Director of Community Programs, effective immediately, reporting to Board Chair for first quarter transition." Ruby held the edge of the table to steady herself. Director titles belong to people with corner offices and polished biographies, not nieces sleeping under sloped ceilings and printing place cards at midnight. She expected resistance from someone, anywhere. None came. The structure had changed, and titles were now following function rather than bloodline. Vivian did resist through channels that no longer bent easily. She filed a procedural complaint alleging conflict of interest, contested by counsel within 48 hours using documented record from gala night, transfer receipts, and witness statements including Clara's corroboration of the West Office conversation. The complaint failed. Her chair role had already been removed and, with Miles gone, she had no coalition strong enough to restore it. Invitations slowed. Calls returned later, if at all. Social isolation arrived in polite delays and unanswered messages, the kind of collapse that leaves no dramatic footage and no path back to prior influence. Ruby moved out on Thursday with 2 suitcases, 3 banker's boxes, and her father's old fountain pen wrapped in a scarf. She rented a small 1-bedroom near the river, 5th floor, narrow balcony, grocery store 2 blocks away. The first night she ate standing at the kitchen counter because she had not unpacked a chair. The quiet felt unfamiliar and honest. No one measured her footsteps on staircases. No one commented on who she spoke to in hallways. Work changed immediately and slowly at once. Immediately because people now asked for her decisions instead of relaying Vivian's. Slowly because institutions keep old habits in their walls even after leadership changes. Ruby built procedures that protected the students she had nearly watched disappear from a list, creating automatic alerts and mandatory dual signatures on removals. She met recipients and their families in daylight rooms without donor theatrics, and each meeting made the abstract line item feel human in a way gala speeches never managed. Edward kept his economy of speech. He requested briefings in concise formats and asked questions that forced clarity rather than performance. He still noticed things others skipped, including who refilled water pitchers at long meetings and who stayed late to fix errors they had not caused. His concealed phase was over, but his way of moving through rooms did not change. Ruby trusted that consistency more than grand gestures. Their connection developed through work first, as both of them seemed to need. He would appear in her doorway near sunset with a 2-line question about scholarship renewal criteria. She would answer, challenge one assumption, and watch him revise course without ego display. Once, after a difficult budget session, he left a small first aid kit on her desk, with no note. The next morning she found it and laughed for the first time at work in weeks. One evening in late June, they visited Ashford Hall together after closing hours to review plans for a smaller student recognition dinner. No donor tiers, no hierarchy by net worth. The ballroom looked gentler without performance lighting. Ruby walked to the side aisle where she had stood during the reveal and felt the old pressure in her chest ease. "You asked me to stay by choice," she said, looking at the empty stage. "I stayed for the work. I stayed for the students. I also stayed because of you." Edward took a breath as if weighing words before spending them. "I hope that was true." She turned toward him. "Are you still testing people?" "Less than before." He looked out across the room. "Concealment gave me certainty. It also gave me distance. I'm trying to keep the first without the second." Ruby understood the trade-off because she lived a version of it herself. dignity that protected her while keeping others at arm's length. "We can try in daylight this time." He smiled, rare and specific, and nodded. By autumn, the Foundation published the first annual report under revised governance. Scholarship retention rose, emergency holds dropped, and recipient communication shifted from conditional language to direct commitment dates. Numbers mattered, but Ruby cared most about smaller evidence. A mother emailed to say she no longer feared waking to find her daughter's name removed without explanation. A student brought a thank you card written in careful block letters and asked if Ruby would keep it in her office. She did. Vivian's name appeared once in the report, listed among former chairs. No photo, no quote. Institutional memory, properly recorded. Miles was gone from all governance pages after his resignation. Jonas remained MC for internal events, still precise, still calm, still the man who had delivered one quiet sentence that reordered every relationship in the room. Clara accepted a formal advisory role on operations equity and used it to train staff leads to identify status abuse before it calcified into policy. On the anniversary of the gala, Ashford Hall hosted a scholarship dinner with 180 seats again. Same room, different map of power. Student families filled the front tables. Donors took seats where assigned without theatrics. Ruby stood near the entrance greeting guests by name, no clipboard pressed to her ribs, no one instructing her to shrink. Edward arrived through the same side corridor he had used the year before. Plain suit, no entourage, and paused beside her before doors opened. "You have a minute," he said. "I do." He held out his hand, the old scar a pale line across his knuckle. "Thank you for speaking to me before you knew." Ruby looked at the scar, then at him. "I spoke because you were hurt." "I know." His fingers closed gently around hers. "That remains my favourite part." Jonas called for seating. Clara gave Ruby a small nod from across the floor, the kind women exchange when they have watched each other survive a structure that finally broke. Ruby took her place near the stage where she had once been corrected for existing too visibly. She read the first student name from the program, clear voice, steady breath, and the room listened. Later, when the lights softened and staff began clearing coffee service, Ruby stood alone for a brief moment at center aisle, exactly where she had once been instructed to return to her station. Earned stillness settled over her like a coat that finally fit. She belonged in the room because she had done the work, protected people with no leverage, and chosen herself when dependency offered easier terms. Edward joined her without speaking, presence quiet beside hers. No declaration was needed. The hierarchy had been reordered, the harm documented, the future made concrete, and the woman who had once been managed as invisible now held authority without raising her voice.